For 6 years, you have been fighting an enemy that believes they are caught up in a racial war to purify Europe by ethnic cleansing and genocide. The imaginary race your enemies have been trying to install as masters of the world are the Germans. You yourself are a country of many ethnicities. Many of your citizens are German-speaking. Some of them have supported the Nazi war. But just as many have tried to oppose the Nazis. Some of your heroes who resisted the Nazi German invasion were of German-speaking families. Now, you are victorious at last, and surely you will not succumb to the base hatred and fear and fulfill your vanquished enemy's vision of racial purity? Or will you? This is episode 138 of War Against Humanity, a series of World War II in real time. I'm Spartacus Olsson. In mid-1945, millions of Germans remained stranded in the states of Central and Southern Europe. Many of them have lived in these countries for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The presence of these German speakers, the Volksdeutsche in Nazi parlance, was one of Hitler's justifications for starting this war. Annexing the parts of Czechoslovakia, he carved out and baptized the Sudetenland, absorbing the rest of Czechoslovakia and invading Poland. On top of that, throughout the war, the Reich expelled millions of Poles and replaced them with German settlers. In the closing days of the war, huge numbers of Germans evacuated or fled westward as the Red Army advanced. But millions still remain. Millions who believe that this is their home, not Germany. By war's end, a rough estimate of the figure is as follows. 4.5 million German speakers still in Czechoslovakia, including refugees from Poland. 4.5 to 5.5 million still in Poland. About 500,000 in Hungary, including German-speaking Jews. 400,000 in Romania, 200,000 in Yugoslavia. Today, I will focus on the situation in Czechoslovakia and Poland. Not only do these countries have the largest populations of German speakers, but they were the main drivers of the movement to expel their German perceived populations. I will briefly give summaries of the situation in other countries as well, though. Early in the war, the London-based Czechoslovak government in exile led by Edvard Beneš concluded that the 3 million Sudeten Germans and the Hungarian minority in Slovakia would have to be expelled. He soon managed to convince the Western Allies that the continued presence of these Germans would leave post-war Czechoslovakia destabilized. In 1942, he declared that national minorities are always, and in Central Europe especially, a real thorn in the side of individual nations. This is especially true if they are German minorities. Beneš's point of view gained further support in the West after the Germans massacred thousands of innocent people in retaliation for the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich by a pair of Czechoslovak SOE agents. By mid-1942, the British government had accepted the principle of expulsions. In July, a Soviet ambassador to the Czechoslovak government in exile assured his counterparts that they could count on the support and understanding of the Kremlin. In 1943, Beneš secured the support of U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, too. On the Polish side, both governments in exile believed that the German-speaking minority would have to be expelled. For the Soviet-backed Lublin Poles, this reflected both nationalistic ambition and their subservience to Stalin's aims. In the summer of 1944, the Soviet dictator informed his client Poles that they would have to accept the Soviet annexation of eastern Polish territories into Soviet Belarus and Ukraine, and that Poles living in these regions would have to move westward. In compensation, Poland would receive territory from Germany as far as the Oder-Neisse line. By September 1944, the London Poles had essentially reached the same position. While they steadfastly opposed Stalin's annexation of eastern Poland, they eventually concluded that it will be almost impossible to stop him from doing so. While maintaining a vocal opposition, the London Poles decided that territorial compensation in the West would make this bitter pill somewhat easier to swallow. Like their communist counterparts, they believed that this new territory must be cleared of its perceived Germans. The Western powers had their reservations about such a vast movement of people. Despite his hard-nosed public rhetoric about the fate of Germany and the Germans, Churchill was not indifferent to the suffering that the plan would cause, along with the sheer logistical difficulty and the responsibility for the arrival of millions of refugees in the occupation zones of post-war Germany. But both Churchill and U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt put aside their moral and political concerns, as well as the advice given by ministers and civil servants, in favor of the maintenance of the wartime alliance. Both men were determined to keep Stalin on side, in Churchill's case, even as his suspicions about the Soviet leader grew. This meant paying off Stalin with Poland's eastern territories. In so doing, the only way to maintain the facade that they had protected Poland's territorial integrity was to compensate Poland with German territory. Before long, Churchill had to sell the idea to the British public and to the House of Commons. Just like his American counterpart, Roosevelt, the Prime Minister knew that his support for population transfers would be publicly and politically condemned. Through the summer of 1944, British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden had already to deflect questions on the subject. So on December 15th, 1944, Churchill made a statement to the House of Commons concerning expulsions from Poland, in which his strategy is to wash the British government's hands of the problem and place the burden of responsibility on the Poles. The Poles are free, so far as Russia and Great Britain are concerned, to extend their territory at the expense of Germany to the west. The transference of several millions of people would have to be effected from the east of Poland to the west or north, as well as the expulsion of the Germans, because that is what is proposed: the total expulsion of the Germans from the area to be acquired by Poland in the west and the north. For expulsion is the method which, so far as we have been able to see, will be the most satisfactory and lasting. There will be no mixture of populations to cause endless troubles, as has been the case in Alsace-Lorraine. A clean sweep will be made. I am not alarmed by the prospect of the disentanglement of populations, nor even by these large transferences, which are more possible in modern conditions than they were ever before. As expected, Churchill's words caused a great deal of unease, especially in some quarters of the political left. Writing of the deaths he anticipated, George Orwell called the plan an enormous crime. In America, things were even more heated. Republican senators accused the administration of abandoning the Atlantic Charter of June 1941, which declared Anglo-American opposition to territorial changes against the will of the peoples concerned. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Churchill did attempt to reach an agreement with Stalin to at least reduce the scale and speed of the deportations. But this last-ditch attempt failed for a couple of reasons. The first was because Churchill got no support from his ailing American counterpart, whose main objective at the Yalta Conference was to secure Soviet participation in the United Nations and his war against Japan. Without the USSR sitting at the table, the international peacekeeping and security organization that FDR hoped would be his legacy would be dead in the water. He was willing to give almost any concession to make this happen and ignored Secretary of State Edward Stettinius' advice that the U.S. should oppose indiscriminate mass transfers of minorities. The second reason was that by the time of the conference, the Red Army had already reached the Neisse River. The British government resigned itself to the outcome. There was no point trying to fight Stalin on something that was inevitable. For his part, Stalin waved away the humanitarian concerns, claiming that there are few Germans left in Poland, as most of them have fled in the face of the advancing Red Army. As we shall see, this assertion is tragically false. After the conference, the mood within the British government was one of resignation. The land transfers will happen, the Germans will be expelled, and there was little the British can do to reduce the severity of the operations. Again, it's not that the British opposed transfers per se. They were mainly concerned about the politics of it. This mood was summarized by the Undersecretary at the Foreign Office in a note to Anthony Eden in March. I regard the possibility of an orderly transfer of population from Eastern Germany and old-fashioned League of Nations lines as so improbable that I do not believe that it is even worth trying at the price of incurring enmity both in Czechoslovakia and Soviet Russia. But just how many Germans are we talking about expelling here? Well, while it is true that some German speakers have already left in advance of the Red Army, the vast majority of them remain in Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe. In fact, a team of British civil servants estimate that this would be the largest population transfer in history. The number of potential expellees, the committee acknowledged, would dwarf the Greco-Turkish or Greco-Bulgarian exchanges which followed the last war. Little historical guidance, therefore, would be available to those charged with executing the transfer. According to the most optimistic scenario, some 5,340,000 Germans would be removable. If Danzig, East Prussia, and Upper Silesia were given to Poland after the war, if the new frontier ran along the line of the Oder River to the north, assigning Breslau and Stettin to the Polish zone, an additional 3,300,000 would have to leave. While the answer Banished gave to questions about the number of Sudeten Germans he proposed to deport fluctuated constantly, the Czechoslovaks, for their part, were believed to want to be rid of approximately half or 1.5 million of their ethnic Germans. The committee thus counted on a total, at the worst, of 10,140,000 people to be transferred. By the end of the Yalta Conference, the expulsions of perceived Germans is already well underway. In fact, already starting in April, the Polish authorities began issuing travel certificates to German citizens of Danzig who wished to depart. These papers request the relevant civil and military authorities to allow the holder to travel across the front to Germany. But this relative restraint proves short-lived, and the Polish government will soon be inspired by events unfolding in Czechoslovakia. There, the process starts pretty much immediately after the Germans surrender on May 9th, and is combined with an outburst of extreme violence. The public mood in Czechoslovakia is particularly vindictive because the end of the war in their country is especially bitter. First, there is the German suppression of the Prague uprising in the final days leading up to the capitulation. On top of that, as Indy covered in his series, German units in western Bohemia continue fighting as late as May 11th. In the days after the capitulation, there is an outpouring of violent and indiscriminate reprisals perpetrated by mobs of enraged Czechoslovaks of beatings, murder, looting, and rape. Colonel Harold Perkins, a Czech-speaking British intelligence officer and certainly no Germanophile, recalls the scene. Retaliation was blind. An old woman was defenestrated. A member of a visiting German orchestra was beaten to death in the street because he could not speak Czech. Others, not all of them Gestapo members, were hanged, doused with gas and lit as living torches. Enraged mobs roamed through hospitals to find easy victims there. But these events, the spontaneous opening days of a time that becomes known as the May Days, are the outlier in that they are launched by mobs of ordinary citizens. The deportations and atrocities that are to follow through May, June, and July and beyond are organized by the Czechoslovak government and executed by the police, army, and armed volunteers. In some areas, Czechoslovak forces herd the perceived Germans into hundreds of internment camps where they are held in truly miserable conditions. One of these camps is the former Nazi concentration camp Theresienstadt. A visiting Soviet official reports to Moscow on the conditions. The Czechs formerly imprisoned in the camp run it and guard the Germans. If one looks in their eyes, one can imagine that only a sense of discipline restrains them from the reprisals and lynchings. The Germans say, "When the Red Army departs, we shall be lost." Right now, a feeling of deep hatred towards the Germans meets you everywhere. They are not being killed, but they are treated like cattle. The Czechs regard them as cattle. The Czechs have shaved the head of every German like a convict. A large white swastika is painted on the back of each German. Decked out in this style, the Germans wander around the camp. A Jewish survivor of Theresienstadt describes the condition the perceived Germans endure as no better than those which the Jews had faced. While it may or may not be true that the Germans in Theresienstadt are not to be killed, the same cannot be said for German speakers elsewhere across Czechoslovakia. At an internment camp in Postoloprty, Czech soldiers shoot somewhere between 700 and 2,000 of them on June 5th and 6th. In Kaunitz College in Brno, at least 300 are shot, hanged, or tortured to death in May and June 1945. At Horn Mostanachi, near Ferov, Czechoslovak soldiers dragged 265 people from a train, forced them to dig a mass grave, and then execute them. People's tribunals are held in towns and cities, dispensing public torture and death sentences on those accused of collaboration of fascist sympathies. Such conditions are by no means unique to Czechoslovakia. Perceived Germans have been interned in camps in Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia, and to a lesser extent in Hungary. In the same time, the expulsions begin. One of the most notorious events of the May Days is the forced march from Brno. On May 30th, a deputation of trade unionists descends on the city hall, led by a communist activist. The leader of the deputation demands that the local authorities expel the Germans of Brno. If not, he declares the munitions workers will take care of the problem themselves. Faced with this ultimatum, the local mayor orders all German-speaking women, children, and men over the age of 60 to present themselves at their nearest police station that evening. They are to carry 3 days' worth of clothes, baggage, and food. Working-age men are to be retained and interned elsewhere. Shortly before midnight, the first column is assembled and marched off in the direction of Austria. Because this is a spontaneous local action, unsanctioned by the Czechoslovak government, and certainly without the direct approval of the Western Allies, the local activists are denied permission to cross the border into occupied Austria. Blocked at the border, they do not allow the deportees to return home, but instead force them into a collection of makeshift camps at the border village of Pohorelice. With inadequate food, water, and sanitation, hundreds die. Another column of Sudeten Germans follows behind. Some are pushed across the border to Austria in the following days to be held in almost equally miserable conditions, where another 1,000 die. It is in May that the mood turns darker in Poland too. Władysław Gomułka, head of the Polish Communist Party and deputy prime minister of the provisional government, sets the tone when he tells the party congress, "We have to expel the Germans because all countries are built on the principle of nationality rather than multi-ethnicity." Beyond questions of nation-building, Gomułka and the Polish government are determined to satisfy the understandable anti-German sentiment that is running high in Poland. By exploiting such sentiments, the Polish government hopes to distract from its close relationship with the almost equally unpopular Soviet Union. On top of this, Stalin is already in the process of deporting some 2 million Poles from the territories east of the river Bug. As it stands, the plan is to house these Polish refugees in the new western lands taken from Germany. The process of expelling the perceived Germans begins with categorization handled by the Ministry of the Recovered Lands. The ministry places Germans into groups. The first group is made up of pre-war German citizens, German-speaking citizens of the Free City of Danzig, and Poles who are eligible for and took German citizenship during occupation. The ministry decides that these people have no hope of successful Polonization. The second group are the Zlonzoks, Kashubs, Mazurs, and other Slavic German ethnic groups. Some of these people were pre-war German citizens, others were Polish citizens. The ministry decides that of these groups, those who took German citizenship must be deported. The rest are Polonizable. I should point out at this point that refusal by a German speaker to accept German Reich citizen was punishable by internment in a concentration camp, a measure taken by the Germans in 1940 when they saw much lower rates of voluntary signing up as Volksdeutsche. In any case, in June, the government declares that the Germans must be expelled immediately, and the Polish army takes over. On June 24th, General Karol Swierczewski issues an order stating, "One must perform one's task in such a harsh and decisive manner that the Germanic vermin do not hide in their houses, but rather will flee from us of their own volition, and then, in their own land, will thank God that they were lucky enough to save their heads." Few Detailed instructions are given to army units, leading to plenty of local variation in how these orders are enforced. The 5th Infantry Division, for example, allows ex-police to carry only 20 kilos of clothes and food. The commander of the 11th Division allows them to use horses and ox-drawn carts to carry themselves and their belongings, although these must be surrendered to Polish forces on the border. By mid-June, the roads between the new territories of western Poland and the border on the river Oder are filled with groups of perceived Germans walking westward. Most of the expellees are women and children, their husbands having been killed, imprisoned, or POW'd, or retained or deported for labor. Short of food and without any shelter, they are dependent on what they can beg, borrow, or steal from the communities they pass through. Out in the open, they are vulnerable to those preying on the defenseless. A 25-year-old woman named Johanna Janes and her 3 children are evicted during the middle of the night from a village near Świbus, which is now renamed Świebodzin as part of the Polonization campaign. At Świbus, the fugitives from many surrounding villages met and formed a great trek, which now started on its way towards Frankfurt an der Oder. We spent the first night in the open. Later, we found barns or sheds to protect us against the weather during the nights. During the walk of 5 weeks on the roads, we lived only by eating potatoes and fruits from the fields, which we dig ourselves. Many weak and sick people, old folks and children had to be left on the road, dead. It was a lamentable procession of utmost misery. We had all lost much weight, and many of us looked like skeletons. Heaven only knows how often we were plundered by Poles or Russians, and how many times the women were sexually assaulted again and again. Johanna's testimony is just one among many millions of people who face similar conditions in the spring and summer of 1945 and beyond into the next decade. In comparison to the atrocities committed by the German Nazis, these acts of ethnic cleansing can and should be viewed as lesser evils. However, they rest on the same principle. They perpetuate the same hatred, the same flawed idea that ethnic purity will lead to more stability, peace, and prosperity. They betray the very cause that the United Nations alliance pledged to fight for in the Atlantic Charter. They soil the shining star that is the valiant victory against the Nazis. Never forget.